I don't normally do retrospectives, apart from reviews and stuff, but I felt this was actually kind of special. Going through my sad tide of Xbox 360 games, I recently got Superman Returns, and I got to thinking, has there ever been a decent Superman game? You get to thinking about games like Batman and Sonic the Hedgehog and various other game franchises that have had rocky starts or rocky middles but managed to get themselves together towards the end, or at some point they had a steady run of solid games. But with Superman, I don't think they ever really have. I know it's a matter of opinion, so this is going to be polarizing to say the least, but I figured I would actually run through the history of officially licensed Superman games and kind of give my take on each one if I know anything about it. So first we have to kind of summate the backstory. The son of Jor-El hasn't exactly had a stellar performance when it comes to video games. I mean, movies, sure, tons of success. Comic sales, definitely. But video games, as I've said, on par with many badly programmed or just boring generic action games that only few gamers or hardcore fans will actually find interesting. And as I said, I did buy Superman Returns, so please don't judge me. Now, you'd think a larger-than-life character with an intriguing backstory and interesting superpowers would make for some 5-star classics that many gamers and fans I think could look back on fondly, in the same way they do, say, Pac-Man or Super Mario. Even Batman, who had a fairly rough start, got it together by the time the 3D shift came around with games like Arkham Asylum and Arkham City. But as I said, this isn't Batman. This is Superman. So I guess we would have to backtrack to the resurgence of video games during the, I suppose, the video game crash. I believe this was towards the 70s at some point, 70s and 80s. So we have to first backtrack. I believe our history lesson begins in 1979, which was the first officially licensed Superman game, which was released on the Atari 2600, a year after the first Superman movie in 1978. Yeah, even movie licensed games in 1979 were a thing. That's insane. So from what I could gather, sources-wise, the player takes control of Superman, who has to repair a bridge destroyed by Lex Luthor, with the penultimate aim being to capture Luthor and his henchmen. You enter a phone booth to turn back into Clark Kent, Superman's human persona, and return to the Daily Planet, which is his workplace, in the shortest amount of time. And to slow Superman's progress, kryptonite is placed all over the levels by Lex Luthor, and if hit by kryptonite, Superman loses his abilities to capture criminals as well as fly. And to regain those powers, he has to find and kiss Lois Lane. And to its credit, simplicity on the side, it was one of the earliest console games to feature a pause option. And that's something that we take for granted nowadays. We just assume that there's a pause button. Not so much in online games. The next Superman game in the official lineup was Superman the Game. Just the game? Yep, that's what it was called. Okay. Released 6 years after the first Superman game. Released for the Atari 400 and 800 as well as the Commodore 64. Originally it was only supposed to be released for the Commodore 64, but I think due to an outpour of support, fan support, it was released for other systems throughout Europe as well. Its outstanding by default selling point was being able to play as Superman's enemy Darkseid. The arcade version soon followed in 1988, and it was the first to feature a two-person co-op, with the second player being able to play as a red-cladded version of Superman, which was impressive for the time. I mean, this was still like the late 80s, but, you know, you already had like Pac-Man and, you know, Mario was already released, so, you know. But it did feature the John Williams Superman theme, so it was the first game outside of Japan to feature that theme. We then fast forward a year later to 1989, with Superman the Man of Steel, released on the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, the MSX, the Amiga, and the Atari ST. It was considered a hybrid action game which featured 3D flying segments, overhead vertical scrolling as well, the first of its kind in the Superman series to do so, and side-scrolling sections, and its keynotes were featuring both Lex Luthor and Darkseid as villains. Next up, in 1992, just 3 years later, we had Superman for the Genesis. It was a side-scrolling arcade game where the player controls Superman through various levels in an effort to defeat various villains, culminating with the evil supervillain Brainiac. So, no Lex Luthor there. In Europe it was called Superman Man of Steel, which was released, as I'm moving on to now, a year later in 1993 for the Sega Master System and Game Gear, so straight up handheld and 8-bit for that one. It was a 2D scrolling action game developed by Graft Gold and published in Europe by Virgin Interactive. A year after that, funnily enough, they're pumping out Superman games at this point. In 1994, the Chronology released The Death and Return of Superman for the Super NES, so the SNES, and the Sega Genesis. And it was essentially a beat-em-up based on the Death of Superman storyline, which was going, I believe, around in the comics or the movies. Again, I'm not the biggest Superman aficionado, so please correct me if I'm wrong on that one. Then there was, in 1997, so there was a 3-year gap here, released Superman for the Game Boy. It was a scrolling action game developed by Titus Software. In 1998, we actually went straight up educational, with Superman Activity Center released for the Mac OS and Microsoft Windows. It was an educational game based on Superman the Animated Series. Oh boy, 1999, here we go. Moving on to a dark year for Superman, with only one game released in that year, and I'm sure you guys know it pretty well. Referred to by several names. One was Superman The New Adventures, or its more commonly referred to name, unofficially known as Superman 64, considered by many to be the worst Superman game ever made, as well as one of the worst games in general, maybe one of the worst for the N64. It's a 3D action game in which the player takes control of Superman, who must rescue his friends from a virtual reality replica of Metropolis, assuming you ever got that far, because I know for a fact those damn ring trials broke many gamers. I know that for a fact. I was actually going to get Superman 64 one time just to own it, and then I saw the price on it. I was just like, that's too much for it. It's not that it was really expensive, it's like Sonic 06. I think it's too much for what it is. Yep, this game is notoriously known among critics as one of the worst games ever made. Its common criticism, one of them, is poor collision detection, unreliable controls, and high difficulty with poor execution, and I would completely agree with that. Yeah, Superman 64, definitely one of the worst ones on this list. Then there was a break for about 3 years, and then in 2002 for the PlayStation 2 and Nintendo GameCube was Superman Shadows of Apocalypse. It was based on Superman the Animated Series, and it used cel-shaded animation, which was cutting edge for the time, to kind of be on par with traditional animation. I guess that's what they were going for. Then we had Superman the Man of Steel, released for the Xbox, and it was an action game from Circus Freak Studios, published by Atari, and it was based on the comic book series of the same name at the time. Then they released in 2003 Superman Countdown to Apocalypse for the Game Boy Advance, and that was also released by Atari, and that was based on the animated series as well. The bosses for the game of note were Livewire, Darkseid, and Bruno Mannheim. Mannheim? I'm not sure of the pronunciation of that. As well as goons and other items. Then, for some reason, in 2005, another educational-based Superman game from VTech was released called Superman the Greatest Superhero, released on July 6th of 2005 for something called the V-Smile. Then we fast forward to 2006 with Superman Returns. It was released for the Nintendo DS, PlayStation 2, Xbox 360, and the original Xbox. It was loosely based on the Superman movie of the same name. I like the fact in the notes it uses the word loosely. It's like they took artistic licensing with this one. Featured the voice and likeness of many of the cast members. A fun fact I do know about this offhand, not using notes or anything to kind of just to make this game was also planned to be released for the PlayStation Portable, but they just couldn't figure out the controls and mechanics, so they ended up scrapping it. And kind of glad they did, because apparently according to Metacritic, the 360 and the original Xbox versions handle the best, not that saying much. Now the Game Boy Advance version, like many Game Boy Advance ports of the more popular versions of that game, not that that's saying much in this case, usually handled slightly differently. Usually for production values or financial reasons. So for the Game Boy Advance port of Superman Returns, it didn't use a full action set of Metropolis, it used the Fortress of Solitude instead, and it combined various puzzle challenges with short flying action sequences. I never understood why they couldn't make a decent Superman game, and running through his backlog, I kind of understand it to an extent. They've had a bad history, and sometimes, you know, people say you can teach an old dog new tricks. In the case of Superman, maybe he's not meant to have a decent video game. Maybe he's meant to be one of those characters that has all the potential in the world, but they don't do anything with it. So I guess I'll end the cast there. Hopefully this hasn't been too long. I've been Heracross Gaming, and we'll catch you next time.